Myself, Dr. Sunil Sawant, Professor and Head, Department of English, Kishanvir Mahavidyalaya Vai. The topic of my today's presentation is T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, was first published in The Egoist around 1919. Now, this essay was later included by Eliot himself in his collection of essays, The Sacred Wood, published next year in 1920. And this essay focuses on the interrelationship among literary classics, individual artists, and the nature of the creative imagination. These three important aspects have been covered by Eliot in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. The way different literary classics, they are interrelated, and he also speaks about individual artists, the way they are related to their tradition, and some views he expresses about creative imagination. What are the key concepts handled by Eliot in this essay? The essay proposes a series of key concepts useful for reading Eliot's own poetry as well as reading modernist kind of literature. Eliot explores the question of the relationship between the tradition, that is, works already pre-existing in a body of literature, and any one poet in particular, which has been called the individual talent. So, the poet of our times is the individual talent, and how he is related to some tradition of literature. And he also examines the relationship between the poet as a person and the poet as a creative intellect. While doing this, Eliot proposes what is known as impersonal theory of poetry. Eliot came relatively hard upon the poetry of the English Romantics, especially romantic poetry written by William Wordsworth. Eliot was against subjectivity, self-expression, individual kind of expression of feelings and emotions in poetry. Eliot's essay gave to the movement of literary modernism the powerful reaction to romanticism, voice, and a clear agenda. Now, what is Eliot's argument? The creative process is an impersonal process, not subjective or personal kind of process. It is impersonal process, despite the tendencies of many readers to persist in identifying the speaker of a poem with the poet. Now, this is because of the influence of romanticism. The readers like to find out the poet, the man behind some poem. Now, the concept of tradition is very important for Eliot. The tradition is at any one time a completed whole that comprises all of the preceding creative endeavor, out of which the individual author creates a new work. The individual author does not create his work of art in a vacuum. He writes his modern day poem in some tradition. Tradition thus is a continuum. The living practitioners of any one discipline add to and so shape and alter the accumulated store of their predecessors' efforts. So, tradition is the accumulated kind of store of the works of art produced by the earlier writers. The past efforts continue to exist in a present that is continuously transforming itself into new efforts that then themselves become the efforts of the past, and so on. So, something produced in our times becomes a matter of past soon. Eliot also proposes the concept of historical sense. The ancients, such as Homer, Sophocles, Seneca, Virgil, Ovid, they were giants who towered over their puny modern descendants, who consequently characterized themselves as pygmies. Eliot comes out firmly against any notion of couching the tradition in terms of a conflict and competition between the old and the new, the past and the present. He asserts that poets cannot write up to the age of 25 unless they have developed what he calls the historical sense. That is, the sense not of the pastness of the past, as he puts it, but of its presence. So the past tradition, the past, whatever is past of mankind, that continues to become relevant to our times, to the present times. The more perfect they are, the more artists express not their own personal lives and points of view, so much as contribute to that living stream of creative endeavor. So the poets of our times, they contribute in some tradition. Eliot introduces a simile drawn from chemistry, and he introduces the concept of a catalyst. The mind allows disparate experiences to combine in new patterns that then form the work of art. So we come to know the process of producing some poem. So many disparate experiences, they get combined because of this catalyst, the mind of the poet, and we have a new work of art. While the catalyst initiates and enables the chemical reaction to take place, resulting in the new compound, the catalyst itself is not otherwise affected, and certainly for all intents and purposes is unchanged by the event. The catalyst does not go any kind of transformation. Poetic composition is an impersonal process engaging the poet's creative and critical faculties, but not necessarily his or her personal life. So Eliot is against mixing personal life in poetry. Now, he is against this romantic concept where poets pour forth their souls in their poetry. For romantics, poetry was self-expression. William Wordsworth, for example, in his preface to lyrical ballads, while defining poetry, he calls poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now, poetry for Wordsworth is an expression of personal emotions that can no longer be contained by the poet unless he expresses them in his poetry. Now, Eliot is against Wordsworth's definition of poetry, and for him, poetry is not an expression of, but an escape from personality. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality, not a turning loose of, but an escape from emotion. So this impersonal theory of poetry gives us this idea that a poem is experience that has been objectified, not subjectified, but objectified by structuring processes and the conscious selection of language, and therefore is, as a statement, self-referential, nothing more and nothing less. So Eliot regards tradition as a living cultural force, and this living cultural force shapes modern day contributions to poetry. The poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium to work with, and through whereby impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. So poetry is the product of the mind of the poet, which provides a kind of medium for the arrival of new poetry in the world. He also talks about artistic expression. They should be seen on its own terms, formed by and adding to generations of tradition, rather than as a mere extension of the personality and emotions of the particular poet. The individual talent writes best when it writes not for the sake of expressing itself as a personality, but for the sake of constantly shaping that tradition, whether that individual talent knows of it or not. The individual talent ought to know what his or her obligations to the tradition are, and to know that one must have absorbed the tradition. Thank you. Thank you very much.